Okay, so we are picking up where we left off at the end of the previous recording. So what I want to emphasize to you at this point is the image that's on the screen. You're going to read about food labels, and specifically this is called the Nutrition Facts Food Label, or the Nutrition Facts Panel. So it is a panel that is on all packages. So we usually just refer to it as the NFP, the Nutrition Facts Panel. So that's the term that I'll be using throughout this course. So want to go ahead and put that terminology in your notes to help yourself out. You are learning about this at a really unique time because it has only been in the recent months that some changes have begun to take place. Now, a law was actually passed a year or two ago saying that certain changes have to be made by a certain point in time. Usually when any kind of legislation is passed, it doesn't take effect immediately. It gives food companies time to make changes. So I believe 2023 may have been the ultimate guideline, but many companies are embracing the changes now, and that is fabulous. So what I'm going to do is explain why that's so fabulous, and we're going to go through this line by line. Everything that you see on the left, all of this content, I do expect that you're going to read that independently, but I'm going to give you a more concise perspective, if you will. So let's start at the very top. Again, this is the Nutrition Facts Panel, and you're always going to see how many servings are in a container. Why would that be there? Well, a lot of times people have a hard time grasping measurements, like a serving size of 2/3 cups. Some of us can visualize that really well, others not so much. So at least you know 1/8 of a container. If there's 8 servings, then 1 serving is 1/8 of that. So 1/8 of the container is 2/3 cup. Now, keep in mind that the law does not require the serving size to be a realistic quantity. For example, there are cans of soup where somebody would routinely eat the whole can of soup because it's small, but it might say on the label that there are 2 servings or even 3 servings, in which case the information on the Nutrition Facts Panel has to be multiplied times 2 or 3 respectively if you're going to eat the entire can. It's been that way on soft drinks for a long time. Many of your bottles of Coke and such will say 2 servings when most people generally drink the whole thing. And so if they look at that, they mistakenly think they're getting what they see when they drink the bottle, when in fact they're getting twice as much. So there's always some gimmickry and some tricks and some finding the loopholes and things. One of the new components of the law that is not yet required to be implemented is that the serving sizes need to be more well aligned with what people actually eat. So for example, cereal boxes routinely will say 3/4 of a cup when research shows that most people eat at least 1.5 cups, which would be double that amount. So you're going to start to see the evolution of that. For now, what you need to know is that you should glance at the serving size to see how realistic it is. If you think, my goodness, that says 1/4 cup, come on, I eat 1 cup of that, then you got to do everything times 4. 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and 1/4, and then what looked good based on 1/4 cup might not look so hot based on 4 1/4 cups, right? Now you notice that the calories are very large. That is one of the things that's being changed as well. It's normally been small print. People complained about that. But I'm going to share with you something. We are going to get into this a little bit later, but here's what it comes down to. There's no science behind calories. When I first started training in nutrition back around 1990, we were really focused on calories, but we've really come a long way, and we no longer put our emphasis on that. We now realize that there's no way to accurately measure the calories in food, nor is there a way to accurately determine the calories that a person needs. So if you've had any estimate of your calorie needs, that's just what it is, an estimate. It's not exact. And even if 3 people stood side by side and got weighed and measured and they were identical in every respect, and they all had exactly the same health status and exactly the same activity level, even if everything about them was identical from everything that we could assess, and so we calculated their needs to be the same, the reality of it is that what's going on the inside would vary from person to person, and one person would need less, and the other person might need more, and the other person it might be accurate. So It's all an estimate, guys. There's no exact science to it. It's a good guideline, though. When we measure food calories, that too is very vague. In fact, the law says that it can be inaccurate by up to 20% in either direction. So they allow for a vast discrepancy. So if something says it has 100 calories, it might actually have a lot less or a lot more, right? So you should not live by calories. So then you ask, well, why did they make it bigger? Just to increase awareness. Most people don't have the education you'll be receiving here, and they don't know how to do the things you're about to learn how to do. So if we tell somebody you need around 1,500 or 2,000 calories a day, and they look at this and they see that one serving has around 200 calories, and they know they're going to eat 3 servings, then they can quickly ascertain that if they eat 3 servings of that today, they'll get about 600-ish calories. And if you only need 1,500 calories a day, that's pretty profound, right? It gives people perspective. If you walk into an establishment and there's a cupcake or a sandwich or a donut or a muffin or whatever on the menu, and it gives you some sort of insight, and you realize that that one item is half of your calorie needs or 3/4 or twice as much, then you can make somewhat of an on-the-fly educated decision. It still doesn't address the healthfulness of the food. It just helps people to regulate their overall calorie intake because there is tremendous research that has been conducted that indicates that people really underestimate what they are consuming. People recall what they have consumed inaccurately. They think it was less than it was. People look at small quantities of things and make assumptions that they have fewer calories than they do because they don't realize that some of those foods are so calorically dense. So there's a lot to it. So what I'm going to say to you right now is let's not focus on the calories. Let's focus on the nutrients. Let's focus on nutrition, because the wonderful thing that you're going to hear reiterated time and again is that when your choices are what we call nutrient dense, very rich in valuable and beneficial nutrients, then you tend not to overeat those types of foods, and therefore your calories generally tend to work themselves out. That'll become more and more obvious as we move forward. Now, let's begin by looking at the nutrition facts stated on the nutrition facts panel. You just learned about the DRI, which you now know is the dietary reference intakes, or the cumulative list of all nutrient needs for all genders and stages of life. So if we have established about how much someone needs of something, then we are able to compare what's in a serving of food to their needs and tell you this serving provides this percent of what you need. So for example, let's look at the sodium line, which is right about in the middle. We have a DRI for sodium. Now, let's keep in mind that, again, the DRIs are a cumulative listing. They say how much we should get, the recommended daily allowance. They often say what is the minimum amount that we should get. We need to get at least this much. And sometimes they say this is the tolerable upper limit, the TUL. The tolerable upper limit is the maximum amount that is safe to consume, because if you go beyond that, you may potentially be ingesting excessive amounts which are harmful. So sodium's a good example. We have a tolerable upper level, a TUL, for sodium. And that particular amount is an amount that we'll dig into when we get to the minerals chapter, because sodium is a mineral. But for now, let's keep it simple. When you look on the sodium line, you do not, let me say that again, you do not need to look at the milligrams. What you want to do is always look to the far right. You don't know how many grams and milligrams of any nutrient that you need. You could pull out a copy of the DRI and go through it meticulously and try to find the total amounts recommended for your gender and life stage, and then you could go through the day trying to tally up everything on a label And oh, by the way, hopefully you're eating foods that don't have labels, in which case you have no clue what's in them, right? So it would be silly for people to count grams and milligrams because most of it's an estimate and most people don't know what's in foods without labels. So we made it simpler for people. We said there is a percentage of what you should consume each day contained within one serving. Again, a serving size of this item is 2/3 of a cup. So if you consume 2/3 of a cup of this product, you will be consuming 7% of what is recommended for a day. So 100% of what you should have, you're getting 7% of it. So the tolerable upper limit for sodium means do not consume more than this amount. This is 100% of what you should get. One serving of this contains 7%. Now this is what you want to write down. If we think in increments of 5, 10, 15, 20, that's all you need to know. The legal definition of low is 5% or less. So if the sodium content is 5% or less, it is low in sodium. If it is 10%, it is moderate, meaning now we're starting to creep up, but things could get much worse. The legal definition of 15% is significant, meaning buyer beware. And the legal definition of high is 20%. So we look at this and we go, sodium is something we need to limit because too much of it is potentially harmful. There's a tolerable upper limit, and one serving of this food provides 7% of that daily recommended intake. So 5% is low, this is pretty close, this can't be horrible. Maybe this one's okay. Now let's use a different example. Let's look at the added sugars line where it says includes 10 grams of added sugars. I just told you 20% is high. So while the sodium wasn't so bad in here, it's got a high amount of added sugars, and added sugars are not good news. That means the sugar has been added into the product, and added sugar has no health value. It's purely what we call empty calories. Calories devoid of any valuable contribution to our health. There's only an itty-bitty bit of room in most of our lives for that. We always have a little bit of room. That's that everything in moderation, but it's small. And a lot of us aren't very good at staying within that small amount, so there's a recommendation for that. All right, you got the basic premise, 5, 10, 15, 20. That gives you some perspective. Let's go line by line. Notice that the words total fat are in bold. That tells you that's a category, total. The total of all kinds of fat that are in this food. That tells you there's lots of different kinds. 2 of them are listed right below it, saturated fat and trans fat. At a later date, we will study fats more in depth, and you will learn that there are also monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. So why aren't those others listed here? Well, the idea is to help consumers make an educated decision so that they're not purchasing things that are harmful if they know how to read the label. So we don't bother to put all the good things on the label because there's just not room for that, and if it's not bad, then it must be good, right? So the things that are potentially harmful are what's highlighted. So while there are recommendations for how much fat people need, that's not what you need to be concerned about is your total fat. What you care about from a health standpoint is more the types of fat that you're consuming. And to my previous point, when you're choosing wisely foods that are nutrient dense, those are the ones with the healthy fats. And we don't tend to overeat the healthier foods, so we are not likely to take in too much total fat. See the pattern? So we don't look at the total fat line. But the saturated fat, as you'll learn later, has loads of evidence behind it. And although in recent years there's been a whole lot of hype like butter is back, bacon's not so bad, all I can say to you at this point in the game is don't believe the hype. We'll get into the science of that later. So it remains that too much saturated fat is harmful. Now, how much saturated fat is tolerable depends on a lot of factors in a person's life. But we do know there is a point at which there is such thing as too much for all of us, and so we have a recommendation for that. As I look at this item, I see that it contains 5% of the total daily recommended amount. There's a tolerable upper limit, meaning don't get more than this amount. So they've set an amount that is 100% of what you should have in a day, and this product contains a low amount per serving. When we look at the trans fat line, you notice there is no percent there. The percent would be for something that has a recommended amount. There is no recommendation for trans fat because we don't want people to take in any of it. It is not good news. And in fact, only within the last year, a new law has been implemented that bans its use in food production with very few exceptions. So as you'll learn at a later date, unfortunately, there is a little bit of trans fat that naturally occurs in animal foods. But what we discovered is that that trans fat structure is not nearly as harmful as the one we've been making in laboratories for years. We'll talk later about why we would have done that. It had a lot of valuable purposes, but unfortunately, once it began to take a toll on health, we realized it was bad, and we have finally managed to pass legislation, and it is now no longer allowed. So hopefully it's always going to say 0 there with but a few exceptions. And if it doesn't say 0 there, then you don't want that food because you don't want any trans fats. You don't even need a percent to guide you. The goal is 0. Cholesterol is a type of fat. We will study that later when we get to the lipids chapter. Lipids is a formal name for fats. L-I-P-I-D-S. Lipid or lipids are the name for fats. So foods contain lipids, and then our body contains lipids. So we take in fat from food, and we process it, and we turn it back into new fat structures. Cholesterol is a substance that is produced in the liver of all animals, whether it's a cow or a chicken or a person. And so ultimately our bodies make the particular lipid called cholesterol so that we have what we need, because we do need some. In fact, our bodies make all we need, and we'll discuss that later, which is why we really don't need to get any cholesterol from food. So again, there's a tolerable upper limit, because if we get too much, then it can be problematic. We'll talk about how much is okay at a later date, but again, all you really care about ultimately is being able to make wise decisions. So, 0%. There is no cholesterol in one serving of this food, and that's good news, right? So we've already looked at the sodium. We've determined 7 is pretty darn close to 5, so you could either say it's low or you could say it's trending towards 10, so low to moderate. Probably not a terrible idea. Notice now that the next line is in bold, total carbohydrate. Just like the total fat line, the word total implies that there are multiple kinds, and so that line indicates the total of all forms of carbohydrate. When we get to the carbohydrate chapter, you will learn about all of the misinformation you have been bombarded with, because it's usually got a spin on it for some sort of a purpose. So guess what line you don't need to look at? The total carbohydrates line. And right now, if you're gasping and you're shocked, good that I've got you on the hook and you're going to hang in there with me, because now your interest is piqued. So I will say this, that I suggest that you put this in your notes right now so that when we refer to it back later, you're not caught off guard. There is only one category of people that ever need to look at the total carbohydrates line, and that is people with diabetes. It doesn't have anything to do with getting diabetes. This line is for people who have diabetes. And the only time it's useful to them is if they have been trained by a registered dietitian on how to use the information. So don't think I haven't encountered plenty of people in my life that looked at that line, even with diabetes, but weren't using it correctly at all. That's what medical nutrition therapy is all about. Teaching people how to use food as a form of medicine, especially when they're ill. So we teach people with diabetes how to look at the total carbohydrate and ensure that they get enough but not too much based on their individual body. We'll get into that more later as well. So for now, the total carbohydrates line is not something we all need to be looking at. Again, there are different forms of carbohydrate. There are in fact 3 structural forms of carbohydrate that we will study. We will study starch, we will study fiber, and we will study sugar. Now, fiber, most people know is good for you. Plenty of people don't realize it's carbohydrate, but that's why it's on the line indented below the word total carbohydrate. So fiber is desirable. We want more fiber. At least we want more fiber that is naturally occurring within nature's creations. We don't want more added fiber that was made in some sort of lab because it doesn't have the same value. So we'll be looking at that later too. But right now, we don't know what kind of fiber's in here. We just know there's fiber. And we know there's 14% of the daily recommendation. Now, this is something you want, so there is a recommended amount you should strive for. So 14%, pretty darn close to 15, so we can safely say there's a significant amount of fiber in here, and since fiber is good and desirable, that's a positive thing. We don't have a line for starches. You'll come to understand why that is later. Nobody needs to think in those terms. But we do have sugars information. Now, up until these changes that are slowly starting to take place, the only sugars line that has been on the label, and you're still going to notice this on many packages, is the one that says total sugars. And I have always been amused when people say, I look at the sugars. And I'll go, really? You look at the sugars line? Yeah, it had 6 grams of sugar. It had 40 grams of sugar. And I'll say to people, how many grams of sugar should you have in a day? And they'll blankly stare back and say, I don't know. And I'll say, then how do you know if that's a little or a lot? Or they'll give me some arbitrary amount. 12. And where did you get that? I read it in a magazine. It was on the internet. Somebody at the gym told me. You're starting to see where I'm coming from, right? Guys, there is no recommendation for total sugar intake. Because as you'll learn more about soon, there are sugars that occur naturally within all of nature's bounty. We call them naturally occurring sugars. Everything but meat and eggs contain naturally occurring sugars. Think about that. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, beans, everything nature produces contains sugars because they were designed as the fuel for our cells, our trillions of cells that sustain our existence. And when we eat those healthful foods like whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, fruits, and vegetables, and even dairy products, we are getting the fuel we need along with a whole host of valuable nutrients. We get the whole package. Those aren't the foods we tend to overeat, and they are the foods that maximize the amount of nutrients that we get that are beneficial to the anatomy and physiology of our being. So the total sugars line has always represented the amount of both the naturally occurring sugars and the sugar that somebody has added. We've never been able to know how much was already in there from nature's ingredients or how much of it has been added by somebody. Added sugar can be anything, so let's think about that. How does honey get into anything? Only if somebody adds it. Honey comes from a beehive. Most of us don't go and stand around sucking on a beehive, right? So the only way that that particular sugar gets into our food is if we add it. Maple syrup comes from a tree. We don't usually go suck on a tree, so the only way that maple syrup gets into our food is if we add it. White sugar, brown sugar, raw sugar, turbinado sugar, anything ending in ose, sucrose, fructose, it doesn't matter. There are all kinds of forms. Agave nectar, well, if you don't know, agave is a plant. It's the one they make tequila from. So when we extract its sugar and then we put it into our food, we have added it. So there's no such thing as added sugars that are better than others or that are healthy. The point is that when you add nothing but sugar in any form, you are adding something with no health value. It is purely calories. Again, there's room for a little bit of added sugars, but not a lot. So the total sugars line has been useless information the entire time it's been there. And right about now, if you are somebody with good attention to detail, which is critical for healthcare, you've already noticed the giveaway. There's no percent on that line. Remember, the percents are the percent of the daily recommended intake. If there is no percent, that means there is no daily recommended intake. So there's no percent on the trans fat line because there's no recommendation because we don't want you to have any. And there's no percent on the total sugars line because there is no recommendation for cumulative intake of sugars from both naturally occurring and added sources. There is only a recommendation for added sugars because we know that you need to limit them and too much is a problem. So now, finally, we're starting to see packages with an added sugars line. And when we see 20% added sugar, it's a huge thumbs down for this choice. That takes us to the last line, protein. Do I have to say this, or is your mind already going there? What's missing? There's no percent. Wait a minute. If there's no percent, that means there is no recommended daily intake. Exactly. So you don't know if 3 grams is a little or a lot or how to even begin to assess that. We're going to get into that later, but I'll say this now because you're probably freaking out to some degree. Everyone's protein needs are unique to their circumstances, age, activity level, different health factors, whether or not they're growing. There are so many things that factor in. So we all have quite different protein needs. But here's the big clincher. In this country, it is more likely that you will take in more protein than you need than not enough. And when we illustrate that later, it will become abundantly clear because protein is in everything. It's in all of your foods. So it's adding up incrementally based on everything you eat in a day. Even foods that aren't healthy have protein in them. And you would be amazed how quickly it adds up. So it's not hard to get enough protein. All of the focus on protein has to do with dieting, and we'll talk about that more later. But suffice it to say that with the exception of people who are ill, this information is really not valuable. From a medical nutrition therapy helping someone with different illnesses, I, as a dietitian, could determine how many grams of protein someone's body needs, and I could tell them, I want you to look at every label, I want you to add up and get an idea, I want you to look for things with this many grams or less because you need to limit yours, or I want you to look for this many grams or more because you need more. Some diseases require protein limits, some require protein increases. So it's really not there for the everyday consumer, and that's why there is no DRI for protein. So again, hopefully right about now you're thinking, holy cow, this runs contrary to all the stuff I thought I knew or I have heard, and now I am ready to get the scoop. So one more thing, at the bottom there is the section with the vitamin D, the calcium, the iron, and the potassium. We don't all need to be looking at that. That's not an everybody, everyday thing. Again, that's there more for medical nutrition therapy purposes. So dietitians like myself, or even a nurse who's in the know, may need to tell patients to look there. I mentioned previously that people whose kidneys don't work may need to limit their potassium intake. So if I tell someone that a serving that contains more than 200 milligrams of potassium is harmful for you based on your disease, they could look at this package and know this might not be a great choice, or that anything more than this would be bad. Those are the applications. It's not all for just everyday use. So very quickly, let me give you a quiz. You walk into the store. You pick up this label. What would you look at first? If your mind doesn't do this automatically, then let me give you the answer, the sodium. And you're going to begin to see that where there is a lot of sodium, there's not a lot of other value, with some exceptions. This is a perfect example of an exception. So if I walked in the store and I picked up a package and I looked at this and I went 7% sodium, well, 5% is low, so it's pretty close to that. Not too shabby. Then I would go, oh, but you know what one of the other biggest culprits is? Saturated fat. And I go, it's low in saturated fat too. Oh, but I need a lot of fiber. Hey, it's got a significant amount of fiber. That's awesome. Oh, wait, what's that other thing I look at? The sugars, the added sugars. Holy cow, it's high in added sugar. That totally took my thumbs up and turned it upside down. The reality of it is you can usually do this in a very simple two-step process. I suggest you give it a whirl. Go and look at some packages. Look at the sodium. If it is 5% or less, give it a thumbs up. Then look at the added sugars. If it is more than 5%, give it a thumbs down. You will be amazed if you sorted packages of foods into two piles, what the different piles would look like. One would be things your great-great-grandmother would recognize, and the other, not so much. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. I just want to take a moment and click through the next few pages, emphasizing that you really should read this carefully. It will reiterate some of the points that I'm making. The Healthy People 2020 nutrition and weight status objectives are very telling. I would just skim through those. It introduces some of this information, so skim through that as well. As you continue, it starts to get into the role of a nurse in nutrition screenings, so that is highly relevant and it's something you want to read, take a couple of notes on. Anthropometric measurements, you now know what that means, so hopefully you're going to understand that in the BMI that I've touched on. We get down into laboratory and diagnostic measures. Think tests. Think, more than anything, blood tests, right? So when we take a blood test, what are we assessing? We are assessing biochemistry. Bio, again, means life, so the chemistry of life. Everything that's happening within inside every one of your trillions of cells are chemical reactions that sustain life. Biochemistry. When we test your blood and we see the products of those chemical reactions in your blood and they are low or high, that tells us if those biochemical processes are taking place correctly or if they are in any way impaired. That's how we diagnose problems and therefore know how to treat them. So that'll be what you'll be learning about as we move forward. So the nursing diagnosis is definitely a section, as well as planning and evaluation, that you want to familiarize yourself with. The first chapter is often one of the most relevant chapters in any textbook, which is why I mentioned this image here to you previously and suggested you jot it down. And as I said initially, you should probably always look at the bullet points both at the beginning and the end of the chapter. As you began, you said, hey, this is what I'm going to need to know when I finish. And as you get to this point, you ask yourself, did I get this information? Do I feel confident and competent? And if not, then you know what to revisit. So be sure to let me know if you have any questions.